Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining this Aprio webinar on COVID-19 cybersecurity fundamentals. I'll be your moderator for this morning's webinar. My name is Dan Schroeder. I'm a partner in charge of Aprio's Information Assurance Services. And I'm very pleased this morning to have joining me on this panel, the gentleman noted here, three leaders in information security with three different companies and three different perspectives, with the idea that I know that you'll leave today's session with a really good perspective, not just on COVID-19 and its implications for cybersecurity, but cybersecurity at large. So before we get into today's session, I'd like for each of the panelists to do a brief introduction of themselves, a little bit about their role, a little bit about their company, and what cybersecurity means to them. So Chris, would you like to get us started?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Dan. Good morning, everybody. My name is Chris Hamilton. I'm the Director of Information Security at Oversight Systems here in Atlanta. Oversight Systems provides a lens into corporate spend, specifically employee-initiated corporate spend. We review those transactions, whether it's purchase card, fleet cards, e-procurement, travel and expense, to look for fraud, waste, abuse, and non-compliance of policy. We generally work with medium to large enterprises. And in terms of information security, it's a passion of mine to make sure that both my company's intellectual property and employee data is safe, as well as the data that our clients entrust to us.
Thank you, Chris. Kaylin, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Sure. Everyone, I'm Kaylin Kingsland. I'm over information security at BitPay. My background is in mostly extremely large financial organizations, a couple of telecom giants and some retail giants. A little bit about BitPay. It's a leader in blockchain payment processing. We enable our customers to spend their cryptocurrency at their favorite food and retail stores, either through their native POSs, prepaid debit card top-ups, gift card top-ups. They can use Bitcoin, Bitcoin Cash, Ethereum, several stable coins. Businesses use it for borderless, cross-border, borderless payments.
Okay, thank you, Kaylin. And finally, Maury Haber from Beyond Trust. Maury?
Thank you, Dan. My name is Maury Haber. I'm the Chief Technology Officer and the Chief Information Security Officer for Beyond Trust. Been with the organization about 17 years through a variety of acquisitions, and I'm also an author. I have 3 books available on Amazon or Springer, covering different types of attack vectors from privilege, asset, and identity management. Here at Beyond Trust, we are a leader in privileged access management and the management of privilege rights that can be stored in a vault or a safe for safe retrieval, rotation, and access. Also endpoint management, where it's the removal of admin rights from devices, and secure remote access, the ability to connect to systems securely remotely without traditional technologies like VPN.
Thank you, Maury. Thank you, panelists. So here's a little bit about our roadmap for today's conversation. We started planning this event, seems like a lifetime ago now, 6 weeks ago, perhaps. COVID was barely a blip on the screen in terms of everybody's thinking at that time. And with that, we had a lot to talk about with respect to cybersecurity, except for the mention specifically to the COVID on here. There's still so much that's happening from the perspective of cybersecurity. What's going on with businesses? What's the nature of the breaches? What should you do to protect yourself? And then COVID happens. And as you'll hear, COVID doesn't necessarily create new risk, but it exacerbates certain vulnerabilities that are common to a lot of companies. And you'll hear about how the cybercrime community is really focusing in on COVID and our emotional susceptibility at this time to create additional forms of exploitation of our companies and our people, of course. So we're going to talk about that. The discussion, the way that this is laid out here, is the idea is that the vast majority of people that are on this call are not cybersecurity experts, like my panelists. They don't live in this day in and day out. So what we thought is before we're going to get to and provide fundamentals, it would be important to have the landscape and some rationale and context as to why those fundamentals are so important. And so because of that, we'll talk about the cyber risk landscape, how COVID puts additional pressures on our people and our business. Let's talk a little bit about why breaches actually happen. And the idea would be that with that as a context, that the fundamentals that we're going to talk about are going to have more meaning to you. So our hope and our goal when we leave this conversation in the next, say, 80 minutes or so, is that everybody that's participating on this comes away with 4, 5, 10, 15 things that are important takeaways for your business to better protect your business, regardless of what your size is, whether you're an emerging startup business or you're even a company that's a little bit more mature and advanced. So with that, let me jump into this. What's going on with cyber risk management? And so this is a slide in a story that I update every year in terms of how things are advancing. We're in the business, Saprio Information Assurance Service, we're in the business of helping to know whether companies are doing the right sorts of things to protect themselves from cyber type of events. So it's really important for us to have a view in our ear to the ground, so to speak, in terms of what's happening in the cyber risk environment. And I got to tell you that when you take a look at the trend line over the past 10 years, 15 years, in particular 2019, it's not great. It's not great even before we start to talk about COVID. The FBI is one of the organizations that monitors cybercrime. Their complaints in 2019 were up very significantly. Losses continue to pile up. This topic of business email compromise, which is a social engineering hack. This is the hack that comes in that is a spear phish that convinces your HR person to send out HR related data, or it convinces your controller or your treasurer to wire money because the CEO needs a check to pay a vendor because they're in the Far East or whatever. That's not a new phenomenon. That goes back 10 years. The Federal Reserve Board has been issuing warnings for that for 10 years, but yet it persists and it actually is increasing. IoT is going to dramatically expand the attack footprint, and that's already happening in 2019. This is some important takeaways, is that when you take a look at all the breaches, and there is goodness here, right? So there's a lot of stark, sobering facts about what's happening in cyber. But inside of that, once you put these into their context, the idea is that there is goodness. There are practical takeaways from all that. One of which is that email is the primary vector for breaches into our organizations. 94% of malware delivered via email, and spear phishing that happens associated with that. Phishing attacks, 80% of reported security incidents. So when it comes time for us to talk about fundamentals, we're really going to hammer home that point in terms of how you're going to protect your business associated with that. What you're going to see in a moment is that, like any significant event that occurs, and let's just say that this is a normal year and COVID hasn't happened, wouldn't that be nice? What you'd be seeing right now is spear phishing that's coming out, and it's from the IRS or it's from the Department of Revenue from your particular state that's putting out notices about taxes, or if it's about the Olympics, there's Olympic tickets, or there's some event. And so the hacking community is always trying to play off of some event that resonates with you to get our people to click on things and hopefully then exploit a vulnerability in our environment. Well, obviously they're capitalizing on COVID in a very, very big way. And so I'm going to drill down on that a little bit more in a moment. So while we've got these sorts of things happening, and it's important to understand as well is that the risk management, cyber risk management, it's easy to armchair quarterback this and say coulda, shoulda, woulda done things to protect things, but the reality of it is security can be complicated. In 2019, the statistics vary, but there's approximately 20 new software vulnerability patches that were released. For certain organizations and for large organizations with relatively complex IT infrastructure, it's almost a nightmare to keep up with all the patches that are released and to try to get those deployed in a timely manner. To that particular point, 60% of breaches in 2019, some reports indicate that 60% of them involve vulnerabilities for which a patch was available but not yet applied. All right, and so we're going to come back and we're going to talk about why that might be and what meaning that might have to you and what you might be able to do to protect yourself from that. If you're like a lot of businesses, you're in the cloud, you're fully there, or you're migrating to it partially, and at least in some manner. And so businesses are increasingly migrating to the cloud, be it Azure, AWS, Google Cloud. They're doing that quickly because of efficiency, because of agility issues, et cetera, et cetera. Cloud can make you more secure. Cloud can make you less secure if you're not careful. And there's been notable breaches. For example, Wells Fargo this past year using AWS, misconfiguration caused a significant breach for that organization. So if it can happen to Wells Fargo, it probably can happen to your organization. Increasing sophistication, persistence, and brazenness of nation states, cybercrime syndicates, and script kiddies. From a cyber perspective, and this is not about FUD, people, the fact of the matter is that, this is robust, it's big, it's oftentimes outside the bounds of law enforcement, et cetera, et cetera. It's nation states that are after data. China was attributed in the Equifax hack recently. There's sophisticated cybercrime syndicates in a lot of parts of the world. You've got very technical, engineering type people understanding cyber, and not other really good opportunities for them to make money. Cyber is a great way to do that. And then a script kiddie is somebody that's not a sophisticated hacker, but that can leverage a lot of the tools that can give can mean they don't need to be sophisticated because the tools are sophisticated, and with a little bit of money and a little bit of motivation, pretty much anybody can be a hacker, as we'll talk about as well. And so, as I've mentioned, the worldwide hacking ecosystem is leveraging all these various vulnerabilities that are in our environments to really create havoc. And so, even before COVID in 2019, phishing was the number1 means of hacking into our environments. And so, there's a lot of things. Domain spoofing would be one where it comes in, and instead of an I being in your domain, it's represented as an L or a 0, or an O is represented as 0, into things that if you've seen some spear phishing training, you could see that's the sort of thing that or the email may even actually look like it's legitimate. But all forms of spoofing, different types of lures that are being used to be able to cause our folks to be able to click on something and then to create an exploitation of some piece of malware that goes into our environment. The FBI periodically issues PSAs, and they did one here in this past week, just relative to this explosion of fraud schemes related to the coronavirus. And so, this has been happening, and all over the places. People are on alert for notices coming from the CDC, from your State Department of Health, from the WHO, et cetera, whomever that it might be. Well, lo and behold, emails are showing up that sure look like they're from the CDC. They look like they're from the WHO. And if your organization is looking for something like that, then your people might very well be in a compromised position because of our emotional state of mind to click on that. And then if you don't have the right defenses in your environment, then that very may well mean that malware is then on the loose in your environment, busy doing its thing to potentially lock you down from ransomware or to exploit your data, that sort of thing. So we've got the FBI from a national perspective. The Western District of Pennsylvania is one of the leading FBI districts in the nation. They've been behind so many takedowns or indictments of global cybercrime initiatives. They recently also issued an alert that talks about the wide range of scams that are happening with respect to Corona. So we could go on and on about this. There's other threat intelligence sources that put out information on a daily basis, and some of these, and pretty much every one of those are highlighting Corona as a primary risk to our organizations. When we were talking about this as part of preparation for this, Chris Chris shared this with me. And Chris, you want to just maybe tell me, Chris, let's just talk a little bit about how you came to see this and how this was prevented from being exposed to the people in your company.
Sure, thanks, Dan. This is kind of typical of what we've seen over the last month or so. Obviously, this is a phishing attempt. It's a play on the desire for people to protect themselves and their families. So they're purporting to have K95 respirator masks available. We actually caught this. We have a tool by Barracuda that it's an email gateway that caught this, detected it as a phishing attempt, and isolated it. Never made it into to our environment. We get an alert on that, and then can review it, and then at that point we can completely block the sending domain, so they don't even make it into our environment at all. But this is typical of what we've been seeing.
What Chris just talked about with his Barracuda secure email gateway, probably one of the more important things that you can be doing to protect your company these days, because of, it's been bad for a long time, but it's going to get worse, and how, quite frankly, cunning and ingenious the hacking community is with respect to pushing out these sorts of this one here is not very sophisticated. The domain was not necessarily spoofed, but you can imagine that could look like it came from, Chris belongs to a professional organization, because I know he's on a professional organization because I see where I see his LinkedIn page, and I spoof that and I send it out to everybody that's part of all of that, and it looks like it, and it comes across, then it might increase the susceptibility in terms of this, or in terms of he clicking on this, if it were to make it to his inbox. In his case, his secure email gateway stepped up and caught this and protected his organization. So secure email gateways, I don't know, was a year or two, these were sort of relatively new and taking off. I think now it's becoming a pretty much of a fundamental security preventive device that you can have in your company. Here's some thoughts, and I want the panelists to also weigh in on this, about why breaches happen. And this is just sort of the reality of all of this, in terms of, we've been at security collectively in a big way for 10 or 15 years now. You can go back to the early aughts when companies like Microsoft said this was job number one, and we had trustworthy computing type of initiatives. But here we are in 2020, and it's as bad as ever. And so I think we need to say, well, why is that? And what are the lessons learned, and what are the takeaways for all of us? Unpatched, and so here we go. We're talking about vulnerabilities and weaknesses and how they get attacked. And we're not going to spend too much time on this, but just to give you a little bit more perspective about this. And we talked about one of these earlier, unpatched and outdated software components. It was just a year or two ago that the first major spate of ransomware swept the globe, and it was Petya and NoPetya and things of this nature, and took out major industrial corporations and caused hundreds of billions of dollars worth of damage. And a lot of that was because companies were running Windows XP, outdated Windows operating system on their endpoints. And so we've got that from endpoints, we've got it from servers. Asset management is something that, asset management means if I don't know I have it, if I don't know I have some component in my environment, then I'm not necessarily going to, I'm not going to necessarily patch it. You can remember there's just a continual stream or flood of patches that are being released into our environments. We talked about, the cloud computing configurations. A lot of times we've got a port open on our network that that hackers use to exploit us. We've got complicated infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. So, gentlemen, our panelists, before I move on, anything from within all this that you'd like to highlight as something that you're aware of, or you put controls in place for your organization?
I can. This is Maury, certainly. BeyondTrust last week released what's called the Microsoft Vulnerability Report for 2020. And we did an analysis of all the vulnerabilities that have been patched by Microsoft, and we've been doing it every year. And for the last 5 years, if you remove admin rights from an end user's workstation, 80% of the vulnerabilities are mitigated or actually stopped from being exploited just by the removal of admin rights. So having the dual role of a CTO and CISO, I can take security best practices and say, look, no one is operating as an admin. No one has that secondary admin account, and enforce everyone to operate as a standard user. And I can easily state 80% of the risks are mitigated, even if I don't have a patch deployed. That even stops phishing attacks because the malware needs admin rights in order to gain hold of the system, especially ransomware, where it uses lateral movement and the permissions of that user to jump to another host. So the best recommendation is to mitigate a lot of why breaches happen is by restricting, controlling, and removing admin rights where possible.
Yeah, thanks, Maury. And we're gonna come back, and that's probably one of the most important takeaways that you could have from today's webinar is what Maury just said about restricting access and removing admin rights that in many cases are the means by which the exploitation occurs. Ransomware, if you didn't hear me say this before, ransomware popped onto the scene. You may recall it first made the headlines because of the movie, the comedy, the North Korean scenario that ultimately they ended up taking down Sony Pictures and others. And a couple, 3 years ago, ransomware was being put out, and people were, the hackers were asking for $300 or $400 in the equivalent of Bitcoin in order for you to be able to get the key to unencrypt your data that was locked up. They've wised up, and as you can imagine, that cyber criminals would do is they start to put a little bit more economic rationale into that to be able to target their ransomware and their activities such that they can demand and obtain much greater ransoms for unlocking businesses. So if you're a critical player in a supply chain somewhere, or you've got a hospital and God forbid they get a hold of that, lives are at stake, they're gonna, potentially take that down. That has not happened in the United States, by the way, the hospital scenario. It has happened in Europe here recently with hospitals and other health-related organizations, even in the age of COVID, just so that you have a sense of the type of psyche that we're dealing with here with this. You can't assume that there's that these folks are going to have any sympathy or empathy in terms of your environment or what you're going through. They're apparently very desperate for money, and there's nothing that they won't stop at in terms of taking down your business. So keep that in mind as you think about the relevance of these for your business. Here's another chart, another graphic that some people would say, and our view on this, and it might be a little bit of an extreme view, but probably one that has a lot of relevancy. And that is, if you've got vulnerabilities in your security environment, where the vulnerability is because I'm running an outdated operating system, because I've got an open port on a network, I left some remote desktop support function that's open to the people that work for me. If I've got a misconfiguration, if my people, for that matter, are susceptible to spear phishing, the cybercrime ecosystem has evolved such that to identify those vulnerabilities and to be able to exploit those. It used to be, seems like eons ago, a few years ago, bigger companies, this was tending to happen to. Now it's becoming very much pervasive. Because of the prevalence of the tools, because of the cost of computing, because of just the growth of the ecosystem and how much money, quite frankly, is to be made, you have that happening. These tools are all tools, and there's a lot more than this, that are, if you're in the hacking business, these are readily available. You go back a couple, 3 years ago, and even around the time that the Equifax hack happened, around that time frame, there was a prevailing thought process that said, when patches are released, you probably have 30 or 60 days or maybe 90 days to apply that patch before the hackers will start to exploit that. That is not to pick on Equifax, but that's a great case study, because when that patch was released, when the software vendor Oracle published that particular patch, it notifies the hacking community that that vulnerability exists. They then turn their tools on whomever they're turning their tools on, and these tools are such that they can scan the internet, they can scan and look for certain types of technologies, they can scan IP addresses that are associated with particular companies, et cetera, to be able to find vulnerabilities, and then to be able to publish those vulnerabilities on sites where people will buy those lists, and or to be able to begin the process of exploiting that. And in fact, that's what happened to Equifax. So it wasn't weeks or months that the exploitation happened. It was literally hours. And that reality, I mean, you may say, well, we're not Equifax, but you live in the same basic ecosystem as Equifax. So Kaylin, I know you've put a lot of thought into this. You have experience with some of these tools. What did I miss, and what would you like to add to that?
Yep. So the great thing about this is that in the middle of the page, there's Kali Linux, and that pretty much comes with all these tools built in with guides that anyone can install and read and learn, and be up and running in a matter of hours. That could at least do some slight damage for the more low-hanging fruit. One thing that you can do to try to counter the cybercrime ecosystem is a working bug bounty program. So a lot of people, well, most people would tend to be paid legally and not gain money illegally, so they don't have to worry about the threat of jail. And a bug bounty system that can capture the vulnerabilities that someone discovers, instead of trying to exploit them for nefarious reasons and making profits illegally, they just submit it to you and say, hey, you have this vulnerability, and I would like to try to get a bounty out of this, and you can patch this and then pay them out for it. So that way you're being notified by not just your own security team, but the entire world of ethical hackers that are also trying to secure the internet.
Yeah, that's awesome, Kaylin. Before I move on to Chris or Maury, anything that you'd like to add to this?
Just that the tools that are out here, as Kaylin has indicated, are available to everyone, and it has that double-edged sword mentality. It can show you what the hackers are trying to do and what they're using. It allows a novice to pick up tools that can be very sophisticated. And also, it's something that your own team should be looking at, or if not, making sure that your pen testers, when they're testing your own organization, are using as well to give the perspective of how you may be breached.
Yeah, terrific. Thank you, Maury. So I guess I want to remind all the attendees, if you've got questions, go ahead and post those in the Q&A button on your Zoom. We will address some of those questions during our conversation. Then, of course, we're going to leave some time at the end of the webinar this morning to address as many of your questions as we can. So with that is some context, here's going to be the core of our conversation this morning. If you've been a student of security, you know that there's standards and protocols, and sometimes these can be dozens or hundreds of pages in terms of what it is that they represent. And sometimes it's hard to keep it into context in terms of where do I really start and what's really most fundamental. So what you see here and what's going to happen today obviously cannot be an all-encompassing, comprehensive discussion or presentation on everything that every company should be doing from a security perspective. It's intended to really hit the fundamentals and to provide some fundamentals for you, hopefully again some relevant, pragmatic takeaways that you can use in your organization to make it more secure, to protect yourself. Even these are relevant before COVID. Many of these are now more especially relevant in this era of COVID. So what you're seeing here is a bit of a framework depiction in terms of cybersecurity, in terms of the sorts of elements and considerations that need to come together to help to ensure that you've got an effective security environment. So we're going to spend some time on these. We may bounce around a little bit. We're going to have some open-ended conversation about this, touch on most of these, and with the idea that we're going to leave you with some pragmatic security fundamentals. Hey, the other reality of COVID these days is we all need to watch our cash a little bit better. We need to watch our expenses more. So when we're talking about these fundamentals, panelists, what I would ask you is, when we're talking about some things, let's talk about and emphasize things that can be done that really don't, emphasize those that are really procedural or process that potentially can yield important security improvements. And if there are investments in terms of tools and architecture, let's maybe have some idea, if we can, in terms of, let's note that as well in terms of potential costs, but that's always very relevant. So we're gonna start this conversation, and we're gonna start with this quadrant over here on the left about securing our people and their devices. Was important before, and now in the last 2 weeks, it seems like we've just flipped the switch, and we went from 60, 70, 80% of the people working in the office at any given point in time to 100% of the people being remote. A lot of those people were prepared, myself, and I think our company, very prepared to be remote. It was sort of business as usual for a lot of us. A lot of folks, this is new. And now we're introducing environments. Again, we're more susceptible to spear phishing. I may not be working off the same laptop or desktop that I was working off of before, and I may or may not have a secure connection. So Chris, why don't you get us started on this one? Because I know your organization has done a lot and had a big point of focus about training. So talk about what you're doing from training and its relevancy today.
Sure, thanks, Dan. Yeah, I'm a big advocate of training your end users, training your employees. That's general information security training as an overview, so they understand why information security, cybersecurity is important to them personally as well as to the company. Why you need to make sure when you're browsing the web, you're going to secure sites, HTTPS versus HTTP. Being cognizant of what you're typing into any site that is asking you for any login credentials, and then in particularly looking at training for email safety, right? Being able to spot phishing and spear phishing attempts. And that training that can be done completely in-house. You can develop your own training. Your security team can, other than time, it's relatively inexpensive to develop your own training on those type of items. There's also multiple learning management systems you can use that will actually send out safe phishing tests to test your employees. It sends out an email that looks very much like an internal email from your IT department saying, hey, your account's about to expire, log in here and update your credentials. And it will pop up if they click on that link. It'll say, hey, this was a phishing test. You should have looked at these indicators on this email to identify that it was a potential phishing attempt. So again, my takeaway is I think the tools with the whiz-bang tools with the blinking lights, those are great and they're needed. But at the end of the day, if you can really get into your user's headspace and make sure that they are always thinking culturally as a company, you're always thinking about security. It's just a valuable enhancement to all the tools you can purchase for relatively little cost and has a high return on investment when compared to if you're having to deal with an actual breach.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Chris. Kaylin, I know you spent a lot, you've been focused in on access and authentication for some time and really have developed a pretty sophisticated customized solution for BitPay, and you're leveraging a concept of zero trust that's gaining more and more recognition these days. Would you like to share with the audience a little bit about that?
Sure. So internally, we are zero trust, and that includes our workstations, our servers, all of our production environments, our cloud services. Everything is considered unsafe and untrustworthy. The only way to make that safe and trustworthy is digitally signing the messages that are sent between the servers and between the humans. Even our email is considered untrusted unless it's digitally signed. To handle that, we use public and private key combos. Is pretty standard with encryption. You have your private key that no one else has, and you have a public key that other people have. And you create your message or the transmission with your private key, and whoever has your public key version can read your messages. The environment with the workstations, we treat them as a, we like to call it a black hole. So if something happens to our workstation, nothing is wrong with it. They can be completely destroyed. All of our data is stored off of the laptops. We treat them as disposable workstations. For our cloud management and our servers, it's the same concept. It's least privilege access. No one has direct access to a server. You have your pipelines that connect to a server or the cloud service, and everything is managed independent of each other. So it does have some drawbacks of our setup. So there are happy mediums with centralized authorities that can help manage users and that type of zero trust. We did take it a step further, and each one is independently managed, so it does add some overhead. But the takeaway from that is, if someone is able to compromise a specific service or a server or a workstation, there's almost no lateral movement that they can make between those devices. The emphasis is on securing the private keys of the individual and the servers. If we think that a key is compromised, it's immediately revoked and a new one is generated and put back out there. For example, if I lose my laptop, I will have to get a new key, because I will consider that untrusted and that it would be compromised, that someone else stole my laptop and now has access to my key, and I would have to go and generate new keys and revoke that key and then spread that key to build the web of trust.
Kaylin, let's put this in the context of the workers that have suddenly found themselves to be working in a remote environment. And let's say that they don't have access to their traditional desktop or laptop that they were using. How does that work in that environment? You've got somebody from BitPay that is now has to work off of a foreign device or something different. How does this work there? How does this help secure that environment? This is kind of a two-part for me. So I'll go into a little bit how we handle it internally as a company, and a little bit on more of how it can be taken for everywhere. Internally, we've built our organization and technology stack and security stack to be 100% remote, regardless of what happens to our office. So for us to transition from working in an office environment to working from home, it was seamless. Our office doesn't have any devices or connections. It's I refer to it as a glorified Starbucks. It has a Wi-Fi access point, and that access point is secured, and that's it. Our connections are all routed through the internet and is encrypted through that method with our keys. For a traditional stack that has workstations, there are you would go into a central authority to make it easier, that could establish the identity and authentication of that person, and then transmit that message to a server. That would be the easiest way to set up for it. Outside of that, is going to be back to the key management of what you're using for it. So your SSH keys, your private keys, it's going to be managing those keys to secure those connections. Going to workstations that you're not on, I'd like to use family members as some examples that they've received some help from their organizations on securing their workstations, for changing DNS settings and changing some router settings to make sure that they're not on a compromised workstation, that they're not on their normal company laptop. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's good. That's a great point too. I'm going to come back to that one in just a moment, Kaylin. So thank you for that. Maury, trust is in your company's name, and beyond trust. And so until now, I really hadn't necessarily coupled the two of zero trust and beyond trust, but I guess the concept is similar. But talk to us about that, and talk to us a little bit more about about the criticality of in today's environment. Again, a little bit elaborating on what you had before about managing access, whether it's just normal user access as well as restricting administrative access from the endpoint in.
Certainly. So as we've changed in terms of our workspace, and as you've spoken about, we find more and more workers working from home. The question is what is the device they're using at home to do the secure connection back in? And this plays into exactly what Kaylin said as a potential attack vector and why zero trust is so important. We now have all these people working from home. Did we allow them to take a notebook home? Is it managed by the organization? Did they physically unplug their desktop and take it home? Or are you allowing them to use their home computers to basically access key information for the environment? Each one of them represents challenges, how they actually connect into the organization and what data they're actually rendering. If it's something the company owns, like a desktop or a laptop, you can secure it with traditional controls, especially if you're using cloud-based technology for vulnerability, patch, antivirus, etc. Then you can allow them to use a secure technology like a VPN to come into the organization and perform work. However, with even VPN technology, there are risks, notably that the devices or VPN technology itself has inherent flaws, and most recently has been widespread or attacked by hackers to implant basically backdoors and malware that can be used at a later date. But the biggest risk is not when you allow them to bring the machine home and use VPN, it's when you're allowing them to use their own home computers. Many organizations do not have enough computers to give to their their newly remote employees to connect in. So they have been giving them VPN technology, they have been providing other remote access solutions, and there are risks, especially with VPN, because you can't trust that the computer is patched, you can't trust that the end user is using a good antivirus program, you don't know if that home computer is shared by multiple users, where there's potentially fast user switching involved and kids are playing games at night or cracks or anything else to make their games glitch appropriately. So it's really a high risk to allow you to punch a hole in your perimeter via VPN and extend it to a home computer. It's kind of why you want to use better secure remote access technology. Technology that basically renders the resources internally in the environment, but in a secure way to the end user. This goes back to Kaylin's zero trust. You have to consider with the changes that are going on that any access or any human intervention, the place that the user is actually working with the system is disposable. If it was stolen, there's nothing there. There's nothing for a hacker to take, and that the connection itself is what begins the trust relationship for someone to work. And that's why secure connections are so important. You got to consider Wi-Fi, you have to consider patching, there should be two-factor, all of the pieces that are necessary. And if you're looking for more information about this, just Google my name on Forbes.com. A new article was posted exactly on this. It's actually my recommendations to other CISOs that cover strong considerations about the secure connections and problems that someone could face now that we have an expanded remote workforce.
Hey, Maury, thank you. That was terrific. Thank you. What I'm rendering right now is 5 tips that were recently posted by the Center for Internet Security relative to this era of telework. Maury just touched on some of these. Maury, if you didn't touch on these, let's come back and do that. And I asked the other panelists as well. You will note Maury talked about as well, a 2FA and well, I don't know if he talked about 2FA, but certainly VPN is being a requirement for remote connectivity. And we would suggest that 2FA, if you're not already deploying 2FA when people are remote outside of your firewall, accessing cloud services or whatever that it might be, that 2FA has become a standard. So Maury, you and the other panelists, what else would you want to elaborate on, or do you disagree with any of the recommendations that are put forward by the CIS?
No, I agree with the CIS recommendations, but I actually think you should tighten them up even further. Two-factor authentication or a challenge response mechanism like getting a text message or having a dedicated app on your phone to prove your identity is key. We've already seen from the previous presentation or the previous slides that username and passwords are one of our weakest links credential-wise, and being able to affirm that the identity is the right person before we allow access is key. especially with the expanded remote workforce. You have to make sure that all of the equipment that the end user is connecting with is up to date, even if you're allowing them to take a computer home. The other computers or other devices and even IoT like Ring doorbells or anything else on that same network, if they're vulnerable and they can be exploited, can be leveraged against the user with their own laptop. There are certain security controls that they should be turning off. They shouldn't be using universal plug and play. They should be using good security for Wi-Fi connection. They should not be connecting to open Wi-Fi's to begin with. And they have to make sure that the rest of their devices, whether they have their own router at home and other infrastructure, even a managed switch, is secure. Essentially, when you're allowing someone to work remotely, you're expanding your office into their home. And without being able to help them or assure that their home is secure, you potentially create another attack vector for that hacker. So if you're using or you've given that remote worker a corporate issued computer that's managed, VPN is perfectly fine. Just make sure everything around it is secure. And if they need help, give them that help to help them patch or do what they need to do. That's what the help desk is for. You're trying to enable them. However, if you are allowing them to use their home computers, don't use a VPN. That's actually one of the worst things you could do. Consider other secure remote access technologies that connect in, that don't do protocol routing. Basically, they don't extend the applications through the network. They only render the information from the cloud or the information on-premise in a browser or a dedicated app, so that you have that demarc or that cutoff line or that firewall to basically block insecure communications, and potentially, if they do get compromised, any lateral movement from ransomware or other type of malware.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, and there's one thing that we could use to tie what Chris brought in with training and what Maury's speaking about with the VPN and remote office. When we have a new hire come on board, they go through an onboarding process, and it's a very manual process just due to the setup that we have. Part of that process, we give them a packet of securing yourself and your family at home. We are a cryptocurrency company, and we are targeted a little more than some other organizations just because of the nature of cryptocurrency. It's not like a bank wire or a transfer where it can be reversed. Once a cryptocurrency is sent, it's gone. You're only going to get it back if they send it back to you. And part of that is going through the need to have multi-factor that's not SMS based, but maybe a Google Authenticator or Duo type multi-factor, or even USB hardware. It's our preferred method. We give a USB hardware like YubiKey to employees to use for their personal life and their work connections. And that makes it to where someone has to physically steal this device from you versus installing a malware or taking over your phone. And the part of that with the SMS text messaging is one of the rise with cryptocurrency thefts are SIM ports. And that's where someone calls your provider, if you have AT&T, for example, and will call your AT&T provider repeatedly until they finally get someone that will say, yes, I'll transfer your phone number to this other phone. You're not making that request. Someone else is making that request. And now they just took ownership of your phone number and will begin issuing resets and issuing two-factor authentications to that new number on their phone. And now they have access to your systems or applications. So part of that is during an onboarding, regular yearly training, constantly bring up the need to take care of your personal digital life as well as the enterprise security.
Yeah, thank you, Kalen. So this topic of, we've got a couple of questions from our audience about RDS. One was about Duo that I think you touched on briefly, as well as using a remote desktop services for working remotely. User would be using a home computer to reach a computer inside the network. Any thoughts on that from the panel?
Yeah, I did reply to that in the Q&A. If you are having Microsoft Remote Desktop enabled and allowing a person at home connecting in through a VPN or other method directly to that machine, that is a high risk methodology to do so. redirecting protocols outside of the perimeter, especially to an uncontrolled computer, and all of the functionalities and APIs available to RDP represents a risk where the home computer can infect the internal computer. I personally do not recommend doing any protocol type sharing native to the operating system, whether it's RDP, SSH, VNC, et cetera, in that type of fashion.
Okay. Good, thank you. So we'll come back to this. We're getting a lot of questions about access and admin. That's obviously very, very critical these days. What do you got? So we have all these people, and all of a sudden our whole workforce is out working remote, and our households are oftentimes, you know, stressed to challenging environments. Now we've got to do, you know, we've online learning, all the kids, all the education. We're probably already limited on resources and desktops, so you know, probably increases the chance of the likelihood that mom or dad's work laptop is being used for, you know, for education or for other purposes. What does your company do? I mean, what do we do from a policy perspective, you know, in terms of do's and don'ts, as well as locking that down to manage this risk of that endpoint becoming less protected, potentially doing other activities that could be introducing, you know, vulnerabilities or malware onto that. Any thoughts on that?
Certainly, when you can't control the end computer, when it's being used by multiple people, or you open up a work computer at night to potentially bring up a child's homework or anything like that, you're introducing an unknown, especially when you're not on the VPN. For example, I take my computer offline, I go open up a school's website, or I mistype a learning website and get redirected to a malicious page or something like that. Mm-hmm. I can infect the computer. I'm not protected at that point by the corporate firewalls, corporate content filtering, corporate proxies, or anything else. And if I did introduce a piece of malware to that system and I do reconnect, it can be the ingress point for your systems. It's no different than traveling remote workers or salespeople. They connect at the hotel, they connect on the airport or in an airplane, and if they were infected, bringing it back into the organization. The primary difference now is we're asking people to work from home that don't have that experience, that don't think the way that the traditional road warrior does. Should I connect? Should I click? Should I do? And we don't have those same defenses at home that we normally put on a remote worker that's traveling all around. So you have to consider, look, a lot of the best practices we had in the past for the road warrior and hardening their machines, we didn't necessarily translate or even have licenses to give to the people we've now enabled at home. And people are making those mistakes.
Right. So the much more pressure, susceptibility to the endpoint, should everybody be correct in thinking that this just places a higher criticality of maintaining your antivirus and your anti-malware and keeping those desktops patched? I think, what was it, Windows 7 just recently expired. If you're running Windows, you should probably be on 10 by now if you're not getting patches. But let's talk a little bit about just making sure that endpoint is properly hardened and protected by AV and malware and otherwise. Any thoughts on that, panel?
I can certainly take a crack.
This is Chris.
Chris, go for it.
Well, I was before I speak to that, or rather than speak, I do want to go back to something Maury had said earlier about if you don't have administrator access, 80% of your vulnerabilities would be a non-issue potentially. One thing you can have end users do on their home computers, and it's just good hygiene, period, is your normal account that you do your day-to-day activities on your home workstation, perhaps not make that the administrator account, right? Limit the functionality of that account and have another admin account to which you have to escalate in order to install software or perform administrator actions. That's something to reference that very important point Maury made before that might be helpful when you're dealing with end users who are using their own home laptops.
Okay.
Chris, that's a great point. And I never thought of it in that context. You could give instructions to that home user, But one of the things that plagues that home community now is getting help desk support to even make that change, whether you write it up or not. Considering how you did help desk or service desk or call center support for your employees internally, ask the question, how are you now going to help those people remotely, and do you have the right tools to do it? Even to check for things like that antivirus and anti-malware is licensed and up to date. Many of the ISPs, like Spectrum and others, offer free antivirus, and the antivirus they offer free is pretty good for Mac and for Windows. Even having instructions for the major locales for them to get that wouldn't be a bad idea, depending on the size and type of organization you have.
Yeah, thanks, gentlemen. Let's move over to this quadrant. We're talking about the securing the infrastructure a little bit, because so many of the breaches and compromises that happen, the root cause does come down to these topics as well. Depending, this is going to vary in complexity depending upon where your infrastructure is at and how complicated it is, and whether it's homogeneous or not, and what role your cloud provider is playing or not. But asset management is something small companies and big companies struggle with. And if you don't know you have it, you can't protect it, is sort of the idea behind that. Why is that? Can we summarize why is that so hard, and what should be the takeaway for our audience? Maybe there's not a simple answer here, gentlemen, but any thoughts on that?
Looks like Kalen's about to jump in.
You're
right, Dan. I think Kalen, Chris,
yep.
and I would agree that there is no good answer here. Just do it.
Do it. We just see where so many companies, big and small and whomever else it is, this is one of the Achilles heel of security. Information security is knowing what you've got. If you don't know what you've got, you can't keep it patched, you can't keep it updated, and this can vary, again, like I said, about depending upon the complexity of your infrastructure, but this seems to be a real common denominator for so many companies. So let's just say, yep, for the time being, unless somebody wants to add to this, it's critical. Do not overlook this. Do your best to make sure that you've got that covered. There's great advice out there from SANS, from ISO, in terms of this is probably one of the foundational pillars of information security. So we'll move on unless anybody has anything to add to that.
Yep, I'll add something quick for that. I remember when I first started in information security over a decade ago, and it was the style of data centers where you owned the space and you had your switches, you put your servers there, and you had to physically plug them in. They were individual servers. They were not virtualized. You didn't have AWS with one host that had 60 servers that were inside that. Back then, you could turn off those network ports, so if someone plugged something in, it didn't connect to the network. Now, and that made it a little easier to track. You could just view them and you could have reports generated. Now with how agile DevOps is, when you create a service, it may create 10 servers with it to support that service with one click of a button, and they're deployed and they're up and running. With most cloud vendors and most virtualized services, they have the capabilities built in to give you alerts when a server is created that's virtualized, and that would kind of tie into proper change management and tracking control within your environment, a proper monitoring and alerting within your environment that can give you when a new server is plugged in. That would be for the data center and your production and development and servers. Now in the office, I mean, anyone can unplug their computer from the wall, plug in a new wireless access point, put a password on it, and connect to that, and now you have a rogue access point. Some access points have rogue detection, where they will detect when a new device has been plugged in that shouldn't be there. A lot don't. From that, we luckily have a small organization, so we're roughly 85 people. We manually go through and look at the ports plugged in and do a manual asset inventory while we can still manage that. That is not very maintainable, just because as you grow, you can't expect to have a team of, say 100 people go and try to track down 50,000 assets inside a building. It's not manageable. There are, there's, as Dan said, there's a lot of guidance out there in software and applications that can help discover it. I think Red Seal is one that you can run, and it will disperse and trace through your network to try to find everything there and then give you a presentation. And also don't forget about your software asset management as well, to track what software you have installed on those libraries. I mean, Equifax had struts with Apache, and trying to track down where that instance is installed on all these servers that is another thing that would go into asset management. That's just a complex task that would done right. It's wonderful.
Yeah.
I fully agree with Kalen. You can't do any security program without proper asset management. You don't know what to protect. You don't know what to patch. You don't know what's end of life. You don't know what's a shadow IT or rogue IT or rogue users. That's why it's such a hard answer to give in terms of securing the infrastructure. Find what you have, document what you have, continuously look for what you have, and then use tools to detect if something inappropriate is being plugged in or connected to your network. There are plenty of horror stories all over the web of someone finding this on their network, or this device has been there for years and no one's managing it. But it all starts with basic asset management. And it's not only the computer or the device, it goes to the users, the applications, and other resources they connect to.
Right. Thank you.
Yep.
I'm going to touch on a couple of these other points here briefly. Segmentation and web application firewall. As a lot of the audience may know, segmentation says that we wall off our network, and not everybody can get to everything within our network. And it's the idea that some data and some services are more important than others, and we have higher security practices and thresholds for the more important data. So we still find today, or you can read about breaches and what's happened where sensitive, significant data wasn't segmented out, didn't have proper access controls around that. More people could get into that than really were necessary. If some of those people could get into it more than necessary, then they can be a vector into that. So any thoughts about segmentations and some fundamental takeaways for the audience on that to the panel?
Yep, so this one's actually my favorite point on this particular part. And with proper segmentation, it slows or prevents the spread and lateral movement inside of a environment. Further out, that web application firewall, you can have the best asset management and the best patching and vulnerability management in the world out of any company in the world. It can be 100% perfect. But if you are not practicing secure coding with your applications that you're developing, then you're still capable of leaking information out. You don't have to access a database directly or a server directly to exfiltrate information anymore. You can have a web browser and make a request through this web browser to exfiltrate information out just from a poor coding practice or a bug that was inadvertently included into a build and then deployed. So that one, the web application firewall is a really critical part of any organization now, with just preventing that type of connection.
To the panel on this topic of patching and vulnerability management, vulnerability management is going to be more than just patches. It could be insecure settings, configuration, ports left open. For that matter, it's the susceptibility of all the human beings on the keyboard as well. But patching in particular, year after year after year, and the difficulty of getting patches applied, as I noted on one of the introductory slides, so many of the vulnerabilities that are compromised were for patches that existed but yet weren't applied. Maybe something else, if you had the answer to that, people would already be doing it. This is not necessarily simple as well, but why is patching so hard? And what's some practical guidance to the audience?
So patching traditionally has been one of those issues that you need to touch every system in every location in a timely manner. And traditionally, patch management solutions require a lot of resources to deploy: staging servers, places to put the patches, connectivity, the device has to be online, etc. And there are some really great tools that do that on premise. It just takes time and it takes infrastructure to do so. I look at that as being fairly old school, especially for things like WSUS or SCCM that really focus mainly on Microsoft and not the rest of the systems. I would strongly encourage teams to look at cloud-based patching solutions. There are quite a few vendors out there that do that, very similar to antivirus and anti-malware. So no matter where the device is, it can connect to the cloud, it can be monitored, it can also help with asset management, and it can get the patches in a timely manner as long as it has network connectivity. The cloud is one of those things that has made patch and even vulnerability management much more easy and realistic for organizations versus what we were dealing with 5-10 years ago.
Is this given that to Maury and the panel, is this another reason why companies should accelerate their migration to the cloud for their infrastructure?
In my opinion, yes, there's plenty of things in this list and on this slide that do better in the cloud, but there are several things on here that are worse in the cloud, but that's a personal opinion. Patch and vulnerability are one of the ones that I believe doing in the cloud is much better served.
Right. So I want to leave some time here at the end to address some of the questions from the audience, and we have several out there I want to get to. I want to talk about a couple of these other categories that we had on this particular chart. The one in the middle in particular that came out of a discussion that the panel was having in preparation for this, that just given the very profound events of the past few weeks and what it's doing to change, really just everybody's lifestyles, whether it's our people, whether it's our vendors, and from the little things about, now we've got to go work from home and we're not used to working at home, to a lot of companies now have vendors around the world that are also displaced. Most of our businesses, small and large, are global. And we have partnerships, and we have key suppliers and vendors that are operating around the world, and many times they're supporting our information systems or our back offices. If you haven't kept up with what's happening in India, we now have very, very significant displacements of people, and very, very significant social implications from all of that. But we've got to make sure that our people and our vendors, we've got to look out for their well-being. If we don't look out for their well-being, then they can't look out for security. So with that, who would like to elaborate on terms of the significance of both of these particular points and considerations, and maybe what your company is doing?
Chris, so we've reached out to all our vendors to get their statements and attestations on how they're handling the COVID-19 crisis. To your point, though, Dan, what they said 2 weeks ago, is that still valid today, especially in a place like India? So it's an ongoing effort, a lot of follow-up and communication back and forth with your vendors, and just holding them accountable to ensuring that they're protecting your data. But it's a lot more communication now than perhaps the annual vendor review that you traditionally do. There has to be a lot more communication back and forth at this point.
Mm-hmm.
So we look at it in two different ways. First, starting on the vendor side, the two different ways are, who are our vendors? We're a mid-size software development company, but we have vendors worldwide. So it is, to Chris's point, that inventory and making sure that we're staying up to date. But it's also assuring that they're secure as well. So for example, we don't allow any vendor, especially a cloud resource, to be onboarded unless they support things like two-factor. If they just use username and passwords, we won't solicit them as a SaaS service for us. The second part of the vendor management piece is how they interact with us. if it's a SaaS company, like I said, one of the requirements being, but second, do we allow them to interface into our environment? And how do they securely connect in? How do we give them credentials? So with this day and age of people now working remotely, having on-site professional services is nearly impossible. So we deliver services to organizations remotely now. We have vendors that deliver services into us. So how are you securing that vendor management supply chain for the work they're doing with you and that final list? As the CISO, my biggest challenge in terms of managing security requirements and day-to-day operations are my people. I could pick the best tools, I could pick the best solutions and policy, but getting people on board and using them without trying to circumvent the policies is a CISO's typical problem. So it's really buy-in. It's actually a popularity contest of saying, yeah, I like that idea, I'm gonna do it and I will abide by it. So managing people, including onboarding or joiner, mover, leaver processes or cradle to grave processes for people and getting them in the right security roles is just as important. And when you put the two of them together, you almost go back to that cost model that Dan spoke about earlier, is saying, what is shelfware? What am I spending money on that I can drop off? Is there ways to use this feature from vendor X to get rid of vendor Y and it doesn't cost me anything? So when you consider all your vendors and how you're interacting with them and the people using those solutions, many times you end up with shelfware or duplicate products. And in order to save costs, especially in these times coming now, just consider what's the overlap and what you can eliminate, because yeah, it might not be the perfect solution, but I can do it here too, and it's good enough.
Yeah, thank you. I want to just spend just a few minutes on this bottom quadrant before we then turn to some audience Q&A. And the significance of the bottom one relative to monitoring and responding says that okay, we've done all these other things in terms of establishing secure practices, procedures, infrastructure, etc. All the training that goes along with that. All this down here is about how do we know the right things are happening, be they anomalous events in our environment. We're seeing traffic coming from a different part of the world, different times of the day. We're seeing movements in the network that look suspicious from our intrusion detection or our intrusion prevention systems and the like, and then whatever we're doing to drive responses to that. So here we are, we're in this environment, and the network topology has changed dramatically for so many companies in terms of people working odd hours, traffic coming from different locations. How significant is this to the typical company, and how are companies, what do you suggest that people do to try to make sure that they've got their arms around this and they're doing the fundamentals about making sure that the right things are happening with their network traffic, that they're identifying anomalies and that they're addressing those as quickly as possible? Anybody?
Dan, I'll take a stab initially. One of the more important items here to me is the SIM, Security Incident Event Management Tool. That's, for the audience, that's a central location where you get feeds from all your devices, the operating systems, other tools. You can have feeds from your IDS, your IPS, your firewalls, all go to a central location where you can aggregate that log data and then set up searches, reviews, and alerts for anomalous activity, like you mentioned, some type of an administrator login at 2 in the morning, perhaps, especially if you don't have any people in other parts of the world that would make sense for. So that's an important thing, just in terms of having all your data available from your various different systems, so then you can review it for anomalous activity. That's a big one. There's tools that range from very expensive to scale back, but open source and free. The trade-off is oftentimes those type of tools require a little bit more knowledge and hand-holding to roll out and to maintain. But I think it's critical that you have all your information, all your log data in one location to review.
Okay, good. Anybody have anything else to add to that? If not, I'm going to turn to audience Q&A at this time.
I would just briefly add that depending on the audience here, whether you're on premise or going to cloud or mostly in cloud. Chris is dead on. As we've expanded this remote workforce outside of what we consider the traditional perimeter, make sure you're collecting all of those connections, access logs, VPN logs into your SIM, whether that's in the cloud or on premise. It is the only way you're going to find out if any of the problems we've been talking about are affecting your company.
All right, so I'm going to try to move through a number of these questions. We'll try to, I don't know if I'm going to call this a lightning round, but we'll try to move through these somewhat quickly here. So here we go. What do you recommend if you work with engineers that need to use various pieces of software for each of the different clients and thus need local admin access to install the software? Any recommendations to get around giving users admin access if they must install software? We hear that a lot. I mean, when we're out reviewing compliance and doing auditing and checking security, so-and-so needs to have admin access for this, that, and everything else. And so that seems to be a common problem. Suggestions from the panel?
Sure. So if this is on the Windows operating system, Microsoft has a tool called AppLocker. Microsoft is fantastic at developing just enough of something to prove its point. And AppLocker is good for like 1 or 2 applications when you hit that scenario. It doesn't scale well to the enterprise, and it's not easy to administer. So if you have a lot of applications and a lot of configurations, a third-party least privilege tool or an endpoint privilege management tool is the proper recourse. BeyondTrust is one of those vendors that does produce a tool for that on Windows, Mac, Unix, Linux, and even network devices, where no one is an admin, but the commands and programs that they need to run as an administrator without the user having that username and password or the credentials to do so. In fact, switching my hat from CTO to CISO, we use it fully internally. We consume our own products or drink our own champagne. Some of the guys say, you know, hey, we eat our own dog food. It just depends on the joke of the day. But the point here is not even my developers, none of my IT staff has admin rights, and they're able to do their jobs effectively every single day, including installing applications, compiling code with the proper tool set to remove admin rights.
Okay, very
Yep,
good.
exactly that.
Mm-hmm. We've got a question here that is a little bit about its encryption of data, therefore it's around ransomware, and we've seen viruses that have breached the network that will encrypt data. I think that's a pretty common threat these days is ransomware. Everybody should be on the lookout for that. How do you handle data on endpoints, whether that is using folder redirection to point the info to the server, and what is your recommendation for this type of breach? So that may be some fundamentals that we've covered, perhaps. Anybody have anything to add to that? And one thing that we didn't talk about that I really want to make sure that we do get out there is, because of the proliferation of ransomware, is backups and having secure backups so that if we need to do that because of ransomware, we've got the accessibility. So with that, anybody want to run with that?
I'll kind of go in how we handle it. And this is unique to us. It may not work for everywhere. We typically don't allow data on endpoints. Everything is cloud stored. So if an endpoint gets encrypted, it cannot transfer to our server. Now, to try to expand that to work for everyone, there are agents or antivirus and malware agents that are more behavioral analysis of applications that are running on a system that can start to identify when a ransomware begins to kick off and begins this encryption or creating the first key to start that encrypting or communicating with the first server that can kind of nip it in the bud. Outside of that, that's about all I would be able to go into fully on it without knowing some extra programs that are out there for it.
Yep.
So you can also look at it from 2 perspectives. Is the first being, where is the sensitive data? If the sensitive data is on the workstation, a file share, or in the cloud, regardless, it always should be backed up. So you need appropriate backup strategy to, Dan, your point. If you're allowing people to keep it on their notebook, you're allowing them to keep it on their desktop, and it doesn't ever go on a server, it's got to be backed up. The second part of that is, how does the encryption or ransomware work? It essentially uses the person's account, however it's infecting the system, to start encrypting those files. And if it bypasses your anti-malware or your defenses, it only has permissions to encrypt what it can touch, your local computer or potentially shares to that. If you're running as an admin, or it's even more of a global admin, domain admin, it can touch everything and infect everything else. So the point here is make sure if people are not running as admin rights, therefore the scope of the encryption is limited. And two, if it doesn't get a hold of a system or even something in the cloud, then you have the backups to recover whatever they may have potentially been compromised or lost.
Yeah, thank you. So let me do this then as we begin to start to wrap things up here. We've covered a lot of ground today, gentlemen. We haven't talked about the top box, but we'll come back to that. So give me each one of you a couple of thoughts relative to if you had to leave the audience with one or two or three things that are really most critical and most fundamental that they should go back and take action on. What would those one or two or three things be for each one of you? So with that, who wants to start?
Yeah, I can start.
Go ahead, Chris.
I'd say a couple things for management and leadership. I would really say setting the tone. The tone for secure operations really needs to come from the top. That's your entire C-suite down to the vice president, director level. Security should flow from the top down, that culture, that mindset of operating in a secure fashion. If your executive team, your leadership team doesn't seem to care about security, your individual contributors, your employees aren't going to either. So that's one. And then the other item, and again, this is one I harp on a lot, is training. Make sure that your user community is trained on the proper cybersecurity and information security, the proper methods in which you operate within your organization. There are some general information security hygiene topics that we've discussed. And then for your particular company, there may be other more granular controls that you want your people to be aware of. So I think leadership and training are two of the big ones that I would leave people with.
Yeah, thank you. Kalen, you want to go next?
Yep, sure. So I will completely parrot Chris on setting the tone at the top. That may be one of the most important things on this slide. You could have the best policies, the best security apparatus in the world, and if your C-suite and executives and senior leadership are disregarding those policies, everyone else will disregard them as well. Setting that tone is critical and key. For my other big one on here, I'll go away from training and say data management and encryption. Data management is incredibly important. If you can identify all the data types that you have, all the data points that you have, the requirements that you need to have for those data points, and here in the US, we have laws and regulations depending on the information that you collect. If you start at that source of data, the rest of these points on these slides will build off of those data points. So if you have social security numbers, your encryption will come in handy, or your encryption will be built, your secure email gateway to prevent access coming in through email, the firewalls, the antivirus, the segmentation, everything will start to build off of what the requirements you set for those specific data management points.
That's excellent. Thank you, Kalen. And Maury?
I would basically agree with my colleagues and then just take it a little bit further. People are the hardest thing, so policy is the most important. People want to do the right thing generally, and having security policies, technology, procedures that is low friction and easy to implement is incredibly important. If you introduce the best policy and the best tool and it takes extra mouse clicks or is cumbersome or annoying, people will reject it. So you have to first start with whatever you're going to do as a policy, whatever you're going to dictate as a management team, you basically need to make it streamlined and even in some cases faster for the end user to do. Now, my bias comes in a little bit in the form of privileged access management. That is securing and identifying all the privileged accounts, the keys to the kingdom, making sure they're managed, their passwords or their keys are rotated on a frequent basis. They are being used with what's called zero trust, as Kaylin has indicated, or even what's called just-in-time access as required. Secondly, the removal of admin rights across the board. People should not be using admin rights every day. In fact, there are many cases where you can get rid of their secondary admin accounts and they can still operate efficiently. And considering that 88% of all attacks occur via some form of remote access, that's the person not actually sitting at the keyboard, securing remote access internally or externally, especially in this day and age, is key to preventing any of the attacks we've talked about.
Great advice, gentlemen. Thank you so much. If we could add to that, I would say that our perspective is we didn't rehearse this, but it sounds like maybe we did, is that this does have to start at the top. And so all those other things that we talked about happening in terms of endpoints and infrastructure and monitoring, et cetera, are not going to happen without this being a management priority. And the whole notion of security being a management system is one it's not necessarily new, but on the other hand, it's not necessarily commonly accepted and thought of such, that it really does need to start there. And the big question is how do we get management, senior management, to make this to be a priority, to build this into, to say, you know, this is why we're doing this. And so we would suggest that it's getting a realistic understanding of loss events, of the environment being encrypted, of losing access to our service, of us losing the data, of the reputational risk, et cetera, et cetera. And that's why we spend time in terms of making sure that people are really aware of the nature of the ecosystem, so that we can put some perspective and some reality into the threats and then the risk and the loss events that it could cause to our business. And then accordingly, translate that into objectives. Let's make sure that this doesn't happen and that doesn't happen and this doesn't happen. And here's the type of investment that we're prepared to do. Investment in people like that are on the panel today, investment in moving to the cloud or using the security tools, as well as policies and procedures and setting the tone and having the importance. So we would suggest that there are programs that are out there, or let's say there are protocols that are out there that people can leverage. And I'm sure a lot of the audience is leveraging things like the NIST cybersecurity framework, other NIST standards such as 171, the cybersecurity maturity model certification. ISO 27001 is for its brevity and clarity, is I think in some respects 27001. That concept was one of the first, internationally recognized to put forward this concept of security being a management system. And then of course other protocols such as that from the EICPA or the Center for Internet Security top, it says 202, but it should say top 20, sorry for that typo, are all excellent resources that the audience can direct themselves to in terms of understanding more specifics in terms of guidance and practices that they can use to put in place. We would suggest use these as a means of assessing the health of your organization, where the gaps are with respect to your objectives, drive corrective actions, and then at the end of the day, you need to be able to measure, monitor, and drive, improvements against all this. Whether you have to produce an attestation report or you're just using this to make sure that the company is doing the right things to protect itself. So with that, I'm going to move towards wrapping up the webinar today. I certainly, in so doing, can't thank enough our panel for sharing all their expertise and experience with you today. I know they all prepared hard, and they've all been, not just for this, but they've been living security for many years, if not decades. And so on the behalf of Aprio and all the attendees, we just want to extend our warmest appreciation for what you did and the thought that you put into all this. So I'm sure that the audience benefited greatly from that. So Maury, Chris, Kaylin, thank you so much for that.
Yeah, thank you.
And I want to remind the audience of Aprio, given the nature of COVID and its significance, has been putting on a series of webinars that have been attended very roundly over the last week or so. That is going to continue. Here are a couple of other webinars that are yet this week. One about payroll tax credits, that it's going to be applicable to a lot of companies. And something else that has become very applicable to so many companies is the SBA loan questions. So we'll be addressing that. If you'd like more assistance on this topic or other COVID related topics, please visit the aprio.com COVID cyber site for more information or to contact me. And with that, I want to again thank the panel, and I want to thank all the attendees for making time to join us here this morning. We hope that you were able to take away a lot of really practical guidance to help your business. So with that, I wish you the best. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.